So thank you again for being here, for your interest in the future of West Virginia, and for your willingness to engage in a constructive and meaningful dialogue. Let's begin. I'll now invite Steve Pearson, owner and editor of The Observer Weekly, to the stage. The Observer Weekly is a local newspaper, and Steve has gained and demonstrated an in-depth understanding of this issue through his reporting on data centers and related issues in our state. This makes him the perfect person to act as this evening's moderator. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. And before we begin, I'd like to give a thank you to Shepherd University, where who's hosting us, and the Stubblefield Institute, who organized this and other events. And you can go and see their events at Stubblefield on their website. I'd like to thank the audience who signed up to attend and who submitted questions. As Ashley said, we use those questions to help generate a discussion guide for our panelists. We will not be taking direct questions from the audience tonight. In the spirit of civility, we asked out of our panelists. We also asked out of our audience. If anyone feels the need to, shout and demonstrate, find one of the fine officers in black, and they can help you find the nearest exit. You can go outside and shout all you want. But we ask that you be respectful of everyone's participation up here. Feel free to engage emotionally with what they're saying, but this is the panel's time to help inform the community here today, and also broadcast and online. So with that, I'll introduce our panelists. From closest to me to farthest, we have Commissioner Cara from the Jefferson County Commission, who is, I believe, 2 or 3 years now into her first term as a county commissioner. Dr. Amy Margolies, from Executive Director of Tucker United. That's from Tucker County, and they have a very interesting project that popped up just about a year ago out there. I have Chris Morris, who is the director of the Data Economy Office from West Virginia, which is a new position that was created last year to oversee data centers and microgrids investments in West Virginia. And from QTS, we have Dado Slezak, who's the Executive Vice President of Utility Innovation. So he has a lot of, he's relatively new to QTS, but he has well over a decade and a half of experience in the industry and investment. So he can speak in depth to how data centers work and how they will be working in the future. So with that, I'm going to ask a kickoff question to all of our panelists, and we'll just start with Cara. So why are you participating in this event, and what do you hope we can take away from this discussion?
So when I decided to run for county commission, I wanted to lead with civility and make sure I'm representing my constituents. And the best way I can represent my constituents is to ensure that we have a public process and transparency and thoughtful public hearings locally to decide what's best for our county. And so the 2045 comprehensive plan that we established before this bill was passed said that we should have data centers in Jefferson County. However, they should be in industrial zoned areas, carefully articulated around the county's growing needs, our infrastructure, and with community input. So when this bill first passed the House of Delegates, I was one of the, I think, first critics of the bill because it took away local transparency, local process, local oversight. I serve on the Planning Commission, and I'm proud of that. I have a background as a commercial real estate appraiser. I understand zoning. I understood that this one-size-fit-all could have the ability to be very damaging for counties, for Jefferson County, and so I knew I had to take a stand. And with humility, a lot of folks stood with me, and so I'd like to just recognize a couple folks here. We have, online and in person, Senator Jason Barrett. Folks might not know this, but when this bill first hit the floor, we got 0% tax revenue. They were going to take all of the real estate taxes from us, redistribute it to the state for other needs. And if it wasn't for Senator Barrett, we would have gotten 0%. And so I want to publicly thank him. And then I'd also like to, commend delegates who voted against it. We have Delegate Anders, we have Delegate Funkhauser, who ultimately voted against the bill. And I'd also like to just say sincerely thank you to my fellow commissioners and the Berkeley County Commission. You know, it takes true leadership to say what is right at the time, and the Berkeley County Commission did everything they could to fight for local control. Local control doesn't always have to say no to data centers, but we want to be involved in the process, and that's why I'm here today. So thank you.
Great.
Amy? Yeah.
Thanks. So I'm here today, I guess, first as a mom. I live in Tucker County, and I have 2 little kids, an almost 6-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. And I'm here for them because I'm invested in their future here in West Virginia. And I'm also here as a public health expert. That's my training. And there has been a large-scale project proposed in our county that brings a lot of concern to us in the community. So I'm here both as a mom and a public health expert, but also here to represent my community as best I can. And I think from the beginning, all we've been asking for is a seat at the table. So this is a good start. We want to have ongoing conversations. We want to have transparent conversations. We want to understand our role in this and how it will impact our counties.
Chris?
Yes. First of all, Ashley, thank you for inviting me and allowing me to participate, and the folks at the Stubblefield Institute. And Steve, thank you. You know, honestly, as was mentioned before, House Bill 2014 created this office, created this job, and passed in the spring of 2025. At the time, I was in the private sector, focusing on expanding broadband into rural unserved areas, and honestly, wasn't paying much attention to House Bill 2014 because it wasn't what I did. I was approached about taking this job, and I really had to think about, is there value in this job? First of all, does it make sense to have data centers in West Virginia? And if so, can we do it in a manner that is responsible and beneficial? And so I had to wrestle with those questions. And so I spent some time thinking about what is a data center? And I view data centers as infrastructure. And it's infrastructure that I use on a daily basis. I think all of us do. On the way here, I used GPS. I went to Shepherd years ago, but I also had to go to some other places on the way here. So I used GPS. I Venmo'd my kid money. I made phone calls. I paid at the pump. And so I quickly realized that data centers provide a vital service to society, and so we're going to use them. And so are there ways that we can benefit from them being located in West Virginia? At the same time, I evaluated that we are a power generation state. Governor Morrissey announced last year his 50 by 50 plan. We generate between 15 and 16 gigawatts of power as a state right now. We use about 12, and so we're exporting power to other states. And so my thought was, if we're going to use them, and I don't see us stepping back from them, can we benefit from them? And then I've landed on the question of, if so, then how do we develop a process to make sure that we locate them strategically and get feedback and have discussion publicly. So thank you for having me.
Same. Thank you for allowing us to kind of share the facts of what we are doing and what we are interested in doing in West Virginia. I came for 2 reasons. The first one is just to listen, because unlike maybe some of the headlines suggest in and around the country, we want to go where people want us, and we don't know where they want us unless we show up and we listen. We go for lunches. We have several people in the room toward our facilities. We show people what the data center actually looks like. We have conversations, listen to what's bothering you, what would you like to have more or less of, and we try to react and find whether there is an opportunity for us to work together. The second reason is to share facts. I can't influence, nor do I desire to influence anybody, but sharing facts we find is important because there is a lot of fact building out there that is not based on data center real knowledge. It's a lot of news, TikTok videos, all sorts of Google pictures and images of not data centers and all sorts of fake information. That we just want to make sure we provide the facts. That way you can form your view and decide for yourself rather than somebody else doing the decision making and interpretation of false information for you.
Well, thank you for our panelists, and hopefully we will get some facts and some good discussion. So based on the questions we received, we organized this into 5 themes. The first one being, what are data centers and why they're coming to West Virginia? The second one is, what are the community's concerns about those data centers? The third theme is how counties and municipalities can provide guidance to the state's data office. So that would be Chris over here. Fourth theme is, what are the economic impacts of data centers, good or bad? And then if we have time, because again we only have an hour and a half, we're going to talk about the power, and because that seems to be one of the big concerns that is out there about how data centers are powered and who pays for that. So we'll dive into it. So I'll lead off with the first question to Dado. Is like, are the data centers that are coming to West Virginia the same or different from what people might see driving around Loudoun County?
So that's a good question. Loudoun County has...
We tried really hard to make good questions, but if it's a bad question, tell me.
I'm usually a loud talker. I'm surprised they need me to be closer. So Loudoun County has all sorts of data centers in it, so we can segment the world into 3 types, just to simplify it. There is these micro data centers, which most people don't even know. When you walk down streets in, say, Washington, D.C., they'll be sitting on top of traffic lights. They're really that small. And all it is a little processing unit or a bottom of cellular towers, and they're intended to be doing some processing at the node to serve the needs that are being sent from your cell phones. That's obviously not what we are coming here to talk about. You've got a second type, and those are enterprise data centers. These would be a little bit larger. We think of it in terms of megawatts. This would be 50 or 100 megawatt facilities, and they will house companies like American Express, Uber, all your needs that needs to be within state, maybe your healthcare information, hospital data being processed there, and those are the second type. There will be several of those types, I'm sure, in West Virginia. There already are, I'm aware, for many years now. The third type is really the one that most people have interest in learning more, and that's people call it hyperscale data centers. These are data centers that can be several hundred megawatts up to north of 1 gigawatt. It would be unusual to be north of, say, 2 gigawatts, because that's a lot of power. But in that zip code is kind of what you would be imagining. And those are certainly the data centers that companies are thinking about building in states that have excess of energy, which West Virginia, as you mentioned, is one of them. And those will require some planning, coordination with the community, with the utility, and with the kind of governmental bodies. So those will be certainly the ones that are considered and will be a big project to pull off.
Well, thank you. So just to follow on to that then, so when we're talking about hyperscale data centers, what makes a location attractive for a project like that? And Chris or Dado, you could answer that.
Yeah, so I can start, because I've been exposed to the industry and QTS. I was investor into QTS many years ago. And in your prior life, the number one question used to be, well, how close is the fiber? And then at the end of the fiber, people would go and build a data center. That's very much changed in roughly the last 5 years, because fiber can get to most places, and you've made a career in building it. So it has flipped into, I think of it as PLP, so it's power, land, and people, is how I think about it. The power needs to be accessible, and it needs to be available where you aren't shipping electrons across the country. So locations like West Virginia are terrific in that the power is already produced here and is presently being exported out, where other states are then building. The land, West Virginia is a little bit more problematic, because it's not easy to build on slopes. Matter of fact, you can't really build a data center building. It's a large office building is all it is. You can't build a large office building on the slopes. I like the slopes. I love cycling, but that's not great. So what you're looking for is large plots of land that have somewhat flat acreage where you can develop. The last piece, so like I said, people, you will be surprised, but the serious parties, I like to think QTS is one of them, will spend a lot of time, sometimes even years, getting to know the geography, the people, the community, because you just cannot pull off a project that size without the people. And that's on many fronts. If you think about it, there is the labor. You need several thousand people that are going to be coming and building a large project like that. So you need a labor pool, and oftentimes those people will stay behind, right? Because they've now spent several years building there. They become members of the community, and that's their new home. Separately, you need people to want you in order to plan something. Your vendors are for QTS are typically local, so we are looking for local suppliers of food, beverages, steel materials, contractors, plumbers, and all that. So you need to kind of have that relationship up front. And then the final piece is there are quite a few jobs that get created. So you need, again, community where you can develop that workforce, help train them. So some universities nearby, you can help stand up programs where you can kind of create the industry that historically didn't exist in that town to have the labor force to work for. So super important. The other topics you mentioned are very important, but have been redesigned. Historically, water consumption, for example, you've mentioned, was a big topic because the data centers were built as evaporative cooling engines. So you would inject water, you would cool, water would evaporate. That's changed dramatically in that most, I don't know if all, I only can speak for QTS, but most have changed their design several years ago, probably at 2020s, where the evaporative cooling is gone from the industry, and it's a closed loop system. If you think about it like a radiator in your house, just you fill it up and the water keeps recycling around the building and doesn't evaporate, so you don't refuel. There's no leakage. So that has been less of a topic, as has the fiber, because we believe the fiber will somehow get there. It's much easier to bring than to find all the other key pieces that I've mentioned.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So and I promise we'll get to other panelists, but I just wanted to drill down because Data has this knowledge here. You talked about a data center. Is that what we're going to see? Are we going to see a single building? Are we looking at projects that have multiple buildings and you build them all at once? And you talked about this labor force. Do they, sort of keep going from one building to another as they build these things out, these campuses?
Yeah, so it of course is developer specific, but it would be very common that it's several buildings that will show up. They will look like office buildings. Your construction timeline also varies, but you can probably start seeing something stood up in 18-ish months is your classic construction timeline. And depending on the size, it could go on for quite a while thereafter. If you have only limited capacity and limiting land, then it's a probably 24-month project. But I think most people that are looking at West Virginia are thinking about the state as, hey, there's so much opportunity to grow because this is a successful energy state that's made a mark on the U.S. state with production of energy, and they're thinking of bigger data centers than just like an enterprise that we discussed earlier. So it would be a longer process.
Okay. Well, I'd like to open up to the rest of the panel to ask questions of Dado. So anything you ever wanted to know about a data center?
You say that they are QTS. You're speaking for one data center company, but your prototype looks more like office buildings, like Class A office buildings. Could you expand on what the exterior facades would look like, since you are potentially coming in this area?
Yeah. So you've obviously seen one of our buildings. We actually work out of these data centers. They are office buildings. The outside of office is very sleek. It's the colors of the company, red, white. When you walk in, what you may remember, there's almost every building is the same. So there's a big American flag that's hanging several stories large, and because we employ a lot of veterans, there is a lot of kind of memorabilia in the lobbies, but they're beautiful buildings. You wouldn't know you are in a data center. There's a door in the back, and it's quiet in the office building, and then behind the door is a bunch of racks. But the outside and people driving by, they will be seeing just the office building, and it's typically optically pleasing building. For QTS, I can imagine there are others who may be different, but not familiar with their designs.
You know, I think with a lot of companies, I'm sure everyone in the audience has their picture of what a data center looks like, and I certainly did too. And I think they vary greatly, which is why I do have reservations about this bill and will continue, because, you know, I'm grateful for the development standards of QTS and the facade requirements that you impose on your company, but not all data centers will be created equal, and so it's very important as a county commissioner that I am very involved in any data center coming into our county, and you know, white on rice. I will, you know, I'm glad that you had me, and I thank you for your civility in working with us, even though there's no codified powers to local commissioners. I think it's very important that we advocate for our residents, because that's what we were elected to do. So even if I don't have any power, I think it's really important that we continue to talk and make sure and ensure that these decisions are with the best interests of our residents. So thank you.
Anyone else have a follow-up on?
Yeah, I guess I would just reflect on that. You know, there is such a spectrum, and I'm glad that you're bringing that nuance, because I think it's a challenge for any community trying to understand the proposals that may be coming. And I think for those of us that happen to be in communities where, you know, we were not engaged from the beginning, we were not advised of the scale, we kind of found out through the back door, and, you know, and it's a concern. And I think in our case in Tucker County, it's not the case of a nice office building with a big American flag and all of that. We don't even know a lot of the details, but what we do know, it's a 1,600 megawatt gas plant with 30 million gallons of diesel stored on site. And that's kind of, I had to try to figure out what the equivalent of that was, because I really couldn't, you know, the scale of it you kind of can't grapple with in a logical way. That's kind of the diesel use of BWI Airport in a year. And that's placed right at the top of a fragile watershed that goes into Blackwater Falls, that goes into Pendleton Lake. That's Pendleton Creek right there. It's 1 mile from the local elementary school. It's right next to the town of Davis and Thomas. And then there's going to be the hyperscale data center complex. So I think the nuance here is important to say, yes, that's fantastic that we have these micro data centers, but I think that's not necessarily the reality that some communities are facing, which it's not just data centers, it's the bring your own power generation that has very real, tangible impacts. You know, these are physical impacts on our communities, and they do affect water, because they affect water through the electricity generation. So even closed loop systems have a trade-off between energy and water. So you can shift away from evaporative cooling, but you still shift towards more electricity. So that means you have these indirect water impacts. So I think it's very important to really take into account what is the full picture of what is being proposed. Because often what the community is finding out, you know, through the back door is that we only understand small phases of the whole picture. We just want to understand, how will this impact us, and how can we provide feedback with our concerns that I think are very legitimate, because we're worried about our families, we're worried about the existing economy that we have, which is very much based on nature-based tourism. So if you put the equivalent of Mount Storm right on top of our town, that's going to change the vibe.
I can comment
Chris.
a couple things. First of all, I'm going to point out that I had never been to a hyperscale facility until I took this job. And so that's one of the first things I wanted to do was really figure out what are we trying to bring to West Virginia. And so I actually went over and toured one of their facilities and left quite impressed with what they do and how they do things. And so, I know in a few minutes we'll go through some of the process of how we evaluate projects, but I can tell you, my perspective was, and I was aware of some small data centers, but I had no idea of the scale and the size of what a hyperscale facility looks like. And so that's one of the first things I did was to try to learn about it. And then just a brief comment in response to to Amy. And I will say this, over the last few months, I've had the opportunity to spend some time with everyone on this panel. And I think that our process has benefited already from our conversations, and I think they'll benefit from this evening. With regard to, and I'll get into the process a little bit more, there are a number of projects that, despite the fact they may be required by law to notify the Department of Commerce within 30 days of being eligible for becoming a high-impact data center, they haven't necessarily started that process. And so there are some projects, and for instance, I have not received, our office has not received an application or a petition for either a microgrid facility or a data center in Tucker County. And so I look forward to learning more about that project. All I know about it's what I see on MetroNews and other social media and whatnot. So, we're obviously committed to making sure that we attract companies that come in that are going to invest, that are going to abide by the rules, and that are going to become a part of the community. And so I'm happy to talk about that when we get to that question.
Okay, great. And so, yeah, just to sort of tie it back to Jefferson County and talk about, where they fit, can anybody speak to what the constraints or limits are in Jefferson County? I mean, how many of these projects can we expect? How many can we squeeze in here, if that's the, or likely to come?
Well, it's multifaceted because you could have a lot of applicants or a lot of interest, but you might not necessarily have power today or in the next 4 years. But there's a lot of things that are at play. You have the ability to have microgrids. You have the ability to, there's new lines that are going to be going through the county at some point over the next 5 years. So that's a likelihood that could bring also more power. But that's through the utility companies. They would have to put an application in if they're pulling off the line, and then they would have to be approved. And so it's not necessarily they would get an approval, but there is the ability for them to apply. And there isn't maybe enough power today, but that's not necessarily how it works. You have to get approvals from the utility provider, and it could be 4 to 6 years out before that electricity is to your site.
So Dado, you mentioned a time frame of 18 to 24 months to build out. And is it feasible to wait 4 to 6 years for power to show up at a location? Or are we talking we need the projects that we're looking at, they need the power today?
Yeah, my boss thinks I'm just jerking around all day, I guess. Yeah, no, it's you're correct. That is part of the problem that the industry is having, really. The timelines frequently, depending on where you are, can be as far as 2035. And the timeline is 2035. Well, there's not a lot that you can do today. Right? That you just sit and wait till 2033 shows up, and in 2033 you start building. Consequently, I think the simplest answer to your question would have been, well, it all depends on what the utility tells us first. And if the utility says they have some power, then that will be your limit and the ceiling of what kind of projects you can do and get done. And then you, in parallel, have conversations with the community to see which community will want you and where you can build. The way it works, just a brief 101, sorry to bore those that already know this, is you find a site that's of size, that's got acres, and community is friendly. You submit application with the utility. That's kind of your step one. Then the utility in the step two takes that application. They do a lot of testing, engineering work. They'll find out what kind of improvements, projects needs to be done in order to give you the kind of power that you're asking for. And step 3, that can be, by the way, as long as a year or even longer. It depends where you are and how complex it is. Step 3, they've completed this analysis. They come back to you with, here's the invoice. If you want this much power, here's what it will cost you. Because if we are asking for it, that's our improvement, and we have to pay for that improvement. And that can be, can be 50, it can be 100, it could be, 500 million. I've seen numbers that are even higher than that, where the utility tells you, you want this much power, here's the timeline, here's the amount of money you have to pay, here's the date by which you need to pay, and then you just sit and wait. And all of that is surely with the projects. I truthfully don't know what's happening in Tucker because I'm not familiar with that project or the party. But anybody that wants to participate would be following that process and waiting for the utility to give them the outcome of their study.
I'd like to mention, I agree with regard to power as being the determining factor generally for a site. Just a couple of thoughts in my conversations with QTS and with hyperscale companies is that is the king. If there's power there, that's where they're going to go. Historically, I think that they have done projects that are connected to the grid, and so and Dotto may want to provide insight if I'm off, but the people that I've talked to are interested in connecting to the grid for their power, and so someone mentioned the microgrid opportunity, and I think that is certainly an option. I think there's some challenges in the Eastern Panhandle with microgrid power, primarily because of a lack of gas availability here. And so, in my conversations with companies that are looking to locate, and I think one of the things that they look at is location and proximity to Loudoun County, Virginia as a desirable thing. There's also flat land here. But the power is going to be, I think, for the short term, the determining factor on how many projects would end up coming to Jefferson County.
And when you say short term, what is that? 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
I can't answer that because I think that there's power generation issues that have to be addressed, and I think there's also transmission, and those are things that aren't solved overnight. And so
Okay. All right. And we don't have anyone
I'm
from
talking
Potomac
like years,
Edison.
not months or
Yeah.
weeks.
And we don't have anyone from Potomac Edison here to answer, where can we plug in? So we'll have to defer that to another evening. Well, let's shift to another theme, and then I've got to do we're being broadcast on MetroNews Television, a subsidiary of WVRC Media. Hope I got that right. So our second theme, I want to sort of drill into the community concerns, and just wanted to lead that off with a little brief of House Bill 2014, which is what, Allison? That's what kicked this all off. And that, really, that bill was introduced March 18th, so a little over a year ago in the legislature. On April 7th, the governor gave a press conference touting this as a great opportunity for West Virginia. And I think it was April 8th or April 9th, Cara and I were talking, and she was one of the early and one of the few elected officials to come out and say, well, this takes away all local control. And that was really a red flag, and that's when I started diving into it. But basically, it defined a couple of things. It defined high-impact data centers, which are greater than 90 megawatts. So I think clearly what Dotto was saying, anything that's, we're talking about hyperscale, clearly falls into that category. Certified microgrids, which is what Dr. Margolies is seeing out in Tucker County, potentially. It established the role that Chris now holds, the data liaison office. And it prohibited local power. So it kind of hit everybody up here. And then it, initially written, it did give all the tax revenue to the state. Over the course of the next week or week and a half, it ping-ponged back and forth through the legislature. And all of the negotiations were about the money. There wasn't a lot of discussion about local control. That really didn't come up by too many, it wasn't raised by too many people in the legislature, and it certainly didn't get any traction. So where it ended up was it passed on April 12th. It was quickly signed into law. Chris was hired in August. They promulgated the rules in November, the day before Thanksgiving, and then they were finalized by the legislature in February. So here we are in the course of a year, a whole new industry in West Virginia. But throughout that process, it's all been at the legislature. It's been, I don't want to say behind closed doors, but I mean, it hasn't been out in the community. So we're starting to see projects come out. The Tucker County project was announced right about the same time as the bill was going through the legislature. I know the QTS project was with Berkeley County, well before that, but it sort of came to, into the public view right about that time. So all we've had in the community is a lot of questions, but not a lot of answers. So I guess I would just throw this open to Cara and Amy. What are the concerns in the community that you've been hearing?
So I want to take a step back. I'd like to kind of survey everyone in the room. My philosophy is two things can be true. You can support data centers, and you can be against the guardrails lacking in HB 2014. So I'd like to just survey the folks in this room, and I know there's folks online and on TV, but who is adamantly opposed to data centers? Okay, I'm seeing 5, 6. Who is supportive with adequate guardrails? So that is the vast majority in this room. And who is build, baby, build, no matter what? Let's close our eyes. All right, so we got 2 in the room. I think it's really important when we have something come to the table that we use our critical thinking. And it's not that I am against data centers, but we need to ensure that our residents are properly represented. I mean, just as a silly example, you could have a data center show up in our county next week, and I have no idea. And I'm not able to advocate for my people. I'm on the Planning Commission. I serve on the Planning Commission and the County Commission. I got elected to serve my local people. I'm the local form of government that is supposed to and instructed to represent you, by the people, for the people. If you strip that away, what do we have? We gave Charleston the keys, and it was a failure by Charleston to give control for our county and how we develop and build our county. We have subdivision regulations. We have a comprehensive plan. We have zoning regulations. We did all of that thoughtfully with community input. Every single decision we made was in public. Every single decision we put in those documents was through public hearings. If a company that was a data center, so QTS, just as an example, I have toured that facility. They have been open with me, and I appreciate that. And that civility is important, for our community to move forward. They are located on industrial zoned land, so about 200 acres or so is on the Jefferson County side, and about 100 acres is on the Berkeley County side. And they had not come to us prior to HB 2014 on the Jefferson side, but they had gone through concept plan approval with Berkeley County. And so that property is well situated and locally supported in the sense that it was zoned correctly. And what that would have initiated was conversations, public hearings, concept plan approvals, site plan approvals, and invited community feedback. It would have allowed for nearby residents to be able to give a public statement about how this would impact their land, ask for proffers. It allows that two-way conversation that we desperately need. And as a Republican, I greatly appreciate local control, and I think that was a failure in this bill, and I'm proud to say that. So there's a lot of things, and then as a commercial appraiser, this type of lack of regulation is not done anywhere. And so I want to preface that. All data centers throughout the country have local control. And so you can be upset at the bill, but don't be upset at folks trying to do the right thing. And don't be upset with local folks who fought back. But be critical of this bill. This bill allowed Charleston to supersede local control. everything we had in place is thrown out the window. And they might say, you know, they might market this as a different name, but it's a data center. And, you know, they have said, folks in charge have said that we still have local powers. That's not true. It's not codified. So, you know, I don't believe what's written. I believe what's said, but what's written. And so I've had legislators over the past year I'd also like to say thank you for joining the conversation the past few weeks. But I have been fighting this for about a year with Berkeley County Commission, you know, many legislators, and I thank them for that. And I welcome everyone to the conversation. Folks who didn't know this was happening but know now, you know, welcome. And I enjoy your input, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. I think, you know, you deserve a seat at the table too. But there's a lot of pitfalls with this bill. There's a lot of improvements that could be made. Local control is the largest, you know, adequate buffers. No guardrails were put in, provisions. So as a real estate appraiser, as an example, Loudoun County has almost $2 billion a year in real estate taxes from data centers. And they have learned over the past 10 years how residents feel about setbacks. So what that used to be 200 feet from a residential dwelling has been increased to 500 feet. So, you know, a year ago when this bill was in the midst of being passed, I spoke out. I went on the radio. I had social media posts. I called everyone I knew that I could and did everything I could at the time. And when the rulemaking in December was going on, I also gave a 2+ page provision to my local legislators. I sent it to them. I've also sent it to Mr. Morris. And one of the requirements I asked for was, you know, lack of, you know, ensuring that we have surface water, ensuring that we have adequate buffers and vegetative screening, and making sure that we put them in locations that make sense for our constituents. So that's what I'd like to see improved. And I hope the legislators listen now that folks are mad.
So, Amy, you have a project in Tucker County. So what are the concerns that you've seen on the ground out there?
Yeah, well, thanks for your words. I think a lot of that really resonates with us in Tucker County and with me personally. I think, you know, we didn't have the luck to have our county commission approached. I think every single local official said they were shocked and surprised by this project. And so I think it kind of started from there, which is, in addition to these concerns with local control, which I believe are kind of the central problem of what we're dealing with right now, is really transparency. A lot is being done in secrecy, and the communities just want to know. You know, I think if it was a small project and it was on someone's private property, you know, no big deal, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about very large-scale projects that have private gain and public costs. And so because they entail public costs, whether those are to our land, our air, or water, then we need to think about that critically and be able to understand, like by knowing the details of what is coming. And we need to be at the table to discuss that and say, this is what we're concerned about. This is why I'm worried about my kid, because he practices soccer right under where the smokestacks are going to be. And I think, you know, as a mom, you never stop worrying. But, you know, I focus on the big picture, which is I'm concerned about larger threats, you know, and I think this is really a concern. As a community, we're going to take on 100% of the costs and only get 30% of the benefit. So I just struggle to understand what the justification for that is. And I think it just comes down to, you know, all of this is about, you know, a right process, right place, and a right profit share. And I think it really comes down to figuring that out, and we cannot figure that out without being at the table. And that is the steady drumbeat we have been saying from Tucker County, is just we want to have a conversation. You know, from the beginning, we've invited fundamental data to the county to talk to us. We know they visited the county very recently, and they still won't meet with us, and we're very cordial with them. We've said we just want to have a conversation, understand what you're planning. You know, the mayor of Davis has asked the same thing. He's against this project. He wanted to know more information. And so I think it comes down to an issue of trust, right? So we have lawmakers who are telling us, Randy Smith said in a public meeting, I'm going to fix this bill. It is wrong, and it didn't happen. And so I think, we've been accompanying the legislative session. We've been meeting with Commerce and having really productive conversations. But I think when it comes down to it, because we've heard so many words not followed by actions, what we need to see are legally binding commitments and specific commitments. So when we talk about, there was an amendment to HB 2014, but it was very vaguely worded. So I think, what does it mean? I think, maybe Chris can enlighten me what inordinate burden means. Can you define that?
It was defined in the legislative rules.
Quantitatively?
I don't have the definition in front of me, but
It's not defined quantitatively, right? So when you say, let's try to prevent inordinate burden, what does that mean? It might mean a different thing to different communities, but without quantitative limits, for example, on water use, if we have folks who are saying, we're not going to use that much water, excellent, then that shouldn't be a problem. But if we set the limits, then we make sure it does not overdraw our groundwater, it does not overwhelm our systems. This is about, I think for a lot of folks in West Virginia, we are all dedicated to innovation. We're dedicated to growing this economy, but we want to be partners in that economy because we live here, and it's our children who are going to be part of that economy. And I think, thinking through when I hear this idea of we need to power our digital future, whose digital future? A lot of West Virginians are not even living in the digital present. Thank you. We have 1 in 5 West Virginians doesn't have access to reliable broadband, and so I think when we think about all of these things, we have to make sure we're not being asked to build this infrastructure and we're going to be last in line to use it.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to skip over to Chris and go to Dado just for a minute, because you're here in the Eastern Panhandle, Berkeley County, and I know your project went through the Berkeley County Planning Office and Commission, and you've built other projects. So what are mitigation best practices, and do you have any examples you could point to in this project or other projects that, of the concerns that you've heard, how does your company address those in other communities?
Yeah, so QTS has somewhere north of 90 buildings around the country, so we've been doing that for 25 or so years. We didn't just join the bandwagon when it became exciting. It was well before that. The hesitation that you see on our side, and I think we briefly addressed it, and why don't you tell us what the design is? The reason for that is because you will never see QTS show up with the headline and no follow-through. So we will only show up once we know the answers, and we'll only make representations and promises once we have got certainty over what's going to happen. So said differently, once we get the utility to tell us, here's what I can give you on this timeline, that's when we start and approach the community. I can't imagine going out there and just making an announcement or building a large office building without talking to the very people that need to work on it. Right? So you will see us very much front and center, mingling around the city. Most likely I'll be moving out here. I was moved once before, and I will be moving out here along with local people, because we do hire up front. We hire local people to help us understand the community. So there's no real secret other than just hearing in the restaurant, hearing in the in the whatever evening entertainment establishment what's bothering people. And yeah, there's always going to be people that have concerns, and we try our best to explain or address them, but there's not much more to it. Really simple and straightforward.
Okay, so Chris, why don't you, if you could walk us through how HB 2014 is being implemented? And you've had a few instances now, I think, to...
Happy to do that. If I could just comment on a couple other things that were stated a moment ago.
Yeah.
I was not there as part of the debate on 2014. I will say, looking backwards, I think that if we are targeting this industry as a state, it makes sense to develop standards from a statewide perspective. And so, that is part of what I'm trying to do. And, there are, I think out of the 55 counties, I think there are around 50 that have no planning or zoning commissions. And so, I've reached out to, Berkeley County. I've had conversations with Putnam County. I've had conversations with Jefferson County about what standards do we need to put in place. And so I'm very open. I think it's important to approach life humbly and recognize that we don't have all the answers. But I think collectively we can work together to create a process that will make sense as a statewide policy. And then now I'll go to the question you asked. Sorry.
Well, now that you've been in the role since August, you've presumably had a few applications. We know you've announced at least two, or the governor's announced them. So how has the process worked so far?
Okay, so yeah, it's been 7 months, and as you can imagine, it's been a little overwhelming in a good way. Setting up an office, getting a budget passed, trying to hire some folks, had no staff. So those are some of the first things that I had to focus on. Also, while interfacing with companies that are considering looking here, and then trying to figure out who the real players are. This is, I think, this legislation got the attention of a lot of legitimate companies, but it also became viewed as an opportunity for others that are looking for a quick buck. And so, trying to figure out who's real and who's not, and then developing a process. And so I want to briefly talk about kind of the process that's been put in place for the high-impact data center side. I'm finalizing and working with our council on the microgrid process. It was put behind the HIDC because of the interest more in connecting to the grid from the projects that were initially having conversations with us. And so, basically what we did was we took the law and then the legislative rules and created an outline. And so, we asked very simple questions to start. And these are on the website, but we need to know the project name, location, a contact, and then we start looking at is the project eligible, and is it more than 90 megawatts of critical IT load or not? If it's not, then it's not eligible to go through this process. And then one that we added as the session was ending was description of data center operations. And honestly, that came about because as we talked to potential projects, it became pretty apparent that there are a couple guys with some acreage that want to do data centers. And these are complex projects that require enormous amounts of capital. And the last thing we're going to do is certify those as projects. And so that was a concern. The next concern became, here's some companies that have vast amounts of money, but they've never done a data center before. And so we want to attract companies that have demonstrated success in other areas. And so one of the things I've done is reached out to locals in other states where projects have been held just to verify, has this company done a good job? Have they been responsive to your needs? And so that is, for me, a very important part of the evaluation is do they have a track record of success? They have to own the land or have control over the land. They have to demonstrate, they have to tell what the estimated capital investment's going to be. They need to provide supporting engineering, financial, or economic documentation, an estimated project completion date, and it's estimated because, again, a lot of it depends on how much power they're trying to get and when that will become available if it's delivered in phases. And then looking at, again, going back to the number one issue is power. One of the things that these applicants have to do is convince us, show us evidence of the availability of power. Someone can't come in and say, someone told us that the regulated utility that they'd get us power next year. In fact, I've had people say, we're gonna have a gigawatt of power January of next year, and I said, when did you start your load study. And they said, oh, we just started that last week. And I said, there's no way that project is going to get power in that amount of time. And so that is an important part of our evaluation. As pointed out earlier, this was, and I apologize, I didn't have an answer to your inordinate burden. I'm happy to look into that and provide that to you. I will say that one of the things that was requested was an analysis of water usage, and I agreed. I agreed with that prior to amending the rule. During this process, I've made a number of friends, including the folks on the panel, but I had friends from the River Coalition that said, hey, look, I know you're looking at that, but what happens if you leave? We need something in the rule. And so that was an attempt to put that analysis into the rule to make sure that that we are taking a look into the water usage. I will point out, anecdotally at least, and Dotto can interject if I'm wrong, but as I'm sure as QTS goes in and evaluates a site, that's one of the considerations you would take into consideration is there ample water? Am I going to put a strain on the water system or be able to actually be successful with this project without doing so? But that is something that we added to the process at the request of others, and then also agreed to put language into the rules to make sure that was enforceable. And then the other things that we take into consideration are proximity to schools, churches, residents, businesses, proximity to historic sites or landmarks, mitigation measures if applicable. So if they indicate that there is I'm just going to make up something, but a national park that's 0.2 of a mile away, well, let's talk about that and how are you going to mitigate our concerns with that location of that project in relation to that area. And then finally, any unique physical or geological conditions affecting the site. And so we try to take a process and be thorough and thoughtful. And I think that this is where we are right now. And is it perfect? Probably not. Can it become better? I would hope so. And I think that having dialogue with people who have different perspectives allows us, and I think we've demonstrated the willingness to sit down and say, okay, what are your suggestions and how can we implement them? So.
Can I ask for a clarification?
Sure.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just curious, you mentioned making sure this is enforceable. So how does that enforcement work? Who does it? And kind of what happens if there's a violation on that?
I'm not a lawyer, so there's one positive. But I'm not exactly qualified to go into the legal remedy of that process. But again, I'm happy to have that.
So
discussion.
just which agency or body is responsible?
Again, I'm happy to follow up and look at what happens if someone challenges a project based on that inordinate burden and how we navigate that.
And I'd like to just thank you, Chris Morris. Leading in civility, we might disagree on the merits of HB 2014, and many of the folks in this room might disagree, but I appreciate the integrity you've had since I first talked to you, and you always take my call. You have connected me with QTS, and so I'm able to better represent the future needs of Jefferson County. One of the many drawbacks of HB 2014 is a lot of this is up to the discretion of your office. And though I think you are full of integrity, there is a lot of room for human error. And when decisions are made not public facing and not on video in the public with local folks, their feet to the fire, there is going to be a lot of room for error. And so the concerns I had when HB 2014 first passed and until today is the ramifications for human error. And it might not be Jefferson County. I sure as heck hope it won't be, because I'm going to fight pretty hard with every data center that will maybe come in. But other counties, I care about West Virginia. I care about local folks being represented. And if you ever leave, or if another person comes in and isn't as well-meaning as you, I do worry about this, and I also worry about human error. I make mistakes, but if there's multiple folks in public talking about something, there's no room for error, or very little.
Yeah, I would say I'm also quite concerned about that, and I've also had very productive conversations. So I do appreciate that. We've talked a lot about trying to improve the process. We know a lot of the issues there, but I think when you think about discretion is not just a pitfall; it's also an opportunity. So the question is, if your office has discretion, what can you do with that discretion? And I think there may be tangible steps you could take that if you put in place now, if you were to move on, that would ensure that the public is involved in the process instead of shut out.
Sure. And thank you, first of all. And I share the sentiment. I think that we've worked well together, and I want to continue to do that. I would say that I agree that I think this is healthy. I think having conversations and allowing people to participate and hear what we're saying and follow up, I think that's healthy, and I think that's beneficial. And even our conversation yesterday, as we prepared, was beneficial to me. And so, some of the things that I want to implement, and I haven't done them yet, and are things like are public facing. And so, one of the things I would like to do is honestly put out an RFI to county commissions, to development authorities, and I don't want to create a ton of work, but even a one-page document that says, hey, are there sites in your community? And I'll say this. There are a lot of communities that are calling saying we want projects. They're not all saying we don't. There are just as many or more that are saying, please bring projects to our community. And so, one of the things, as Dotto mentioned, they want to be wanted. And so if I can get information from local folks about, okay, yeah, there are sites that make sense in Jefferson County, or there are sites in the Eastern Panhandle that make sense. And we can say, okay, when they come to town, one of the things they ask is, hey, are there any sites? And I'd love to say, actually, yes, here is a list of sites that we believe will fit your parameters and also receive some community support. Mm-hmm. So that was one idea. And then the other one is to create an advisory council. And I'd like to include people just like this panel and more. And so a locally elected official, a community advocate, an industry expert, a utility expert, someone from academia, some legislative input. Those are just off the top of the head. But bringing all these different perspectives together and then having public conversations about how can we make this process work for our state. And so I think those are the things that I'm committed to doing to kind of address what you've stated are concerns, and I think they're legitimate.
I mean, one of the things I would like to see mitigated is just having guardrails put back into the bill. So next legislative session, I would advocate for local control of some sort. In Jefferson County, just speaking for one county, we have had 3 years of drought conditions, and we do have water problems, of some sort, and a lot of what we don't know. But using surface water versus groundwater is, once it's taken out, it will take potentially hundreds of years to recharge. So it's important, and from speaking with folks who might not vote the same way as me, but that's what they care about, and that's a lot of the folks that I represent. So it's my job to listen to everyone, regardless of your political status. And I would say for folks here and folks listening, this isn't just a Democrat-Republican issue. This is local control, and that goes beyond party. And so it's important that we institute local control back, which is a fundamental Republican principle, and ensure that we have adequate setbacks. So ensuring that we have something added in that if it backs to a residential subdivision, that they have adequate buffers between the data center, so it's palatable. So if we don't have control over where it's done, at least how it's done. So building standards. QTS is a great example of how it could look that I think would be palatable by residents, and so developing some sort of standard of best practice so that when they go into areas, the view shed is better. And with vegetative screening, and different parts of the state have different concerns. I'm just speaking as a Jefferson County commissioner, but I think having local input when you're making decisions in their county is critical. So having some sort of advisory council where you have local folks as you are potentially considering projects is very important.
Real quick follow-up, and I agree. I think that there's different needs across the state, And as I pointed out, 50 of the counties don't have staff focused on that. And so while I serve as a single point of contact for what people view as the industry, I also serve as a single point of contact for you and for anybody else that wants to talk about projects and how we can make them successful. And so, in counties that don't have planning or zoning commissions, or maybe they don't have very much of a budget, or maybe they don't have any staff or limited staff, I would love to have those standards developed, some minimum statewide standards, so that we can make sure that projects go into other areas of the state that don't have the benefits that you have in Jefferson County.
I would just maybe endorse one idea. I can't speak to the design of HB 2014 or the process, but what is pretty special in West Virginia with this office is it helps screen for you and creates a coordination contact for us, where you would otherwise potentially be inundated by 50 different companies that show up, and each of them you have to teach them what's important, what matters, why. These conversations, if they can be synchronized through one group, where you can tell that group what matters to the community, and then they can screen for you, I think that's super helpful. Of course, guardrails are important, as is transparency and all the other points, but I found the coordination in this state to be much easier to navigate, and the office has been terrific in. We don't know who the community leader is. You might end up in the wrong person asking them what matters, and they tell you nothing, go baby build. So the office has been super helpful in showing us and pointing, opening the doors to speak to the right people. I think that's been terrific, and I think it's put West Virginia on the forefront of and very much kind of top tier against the other states in the country.
So I'll assume from your conversation that you're contemplating other projects in West Virginia, since you've already, established one. But I did want to ask a follow-up on Chris. You talked about a staff. Can you describe, what types of people you're hiring, how big this office is going to be, and what functions you'll have internally, and then what other agencies you interface with?
Sure. So, thank you. So far, I've not hired anyone yet. I do have some folks on loan from other areas in the Office of Energy and Economic Development Division that are helping with sites and just general support. And so, one of the things I think that's important, and I think it's obvious today, is to have some type of local coordinator. I can do it right now, but if there's projects in multiple sites across the state, it's not practical to think that I can go into every county and be that point of contact for every meeting and be able to communicate to the level. And I'll be the first person to say, when you're doing 100 top priorities, one of the things that is lacking is communication. And so having some team build out where we can have people spend time in the communities and communicating what we're doing and getting feedback and getting ideas, that is a top priority. As far as what we do, so under the bill, companies will approach us and say, we have an idea or we have a project, and so they submit information, and then we take a look at it against the code and against the rules and against our process and say, this is incomplete. Or that's generally been the most common answer. And you need to explain a lot better on the following items, whatever's missing. Once a project is then submitted enough information that at least it can be evaluated, we have by code 14 days to then evaluate that information, and then I have to make a recommendation, and the Secretary of Commerce has to then decide whether or not they receive their designation. And so the next question is what does that designation mean, or what happens after that designation? And so, I think it's important to point out that that designation does not include any removal of any of the other permits as far as any environmental permitting, water permits, air quality permits. So one of the things that this office would do is then connect the project applicant to DEP and get people from that staff to say, here's our process, here's how you apply for your fill-in-the-blank permits that are applicable to that project. They have to go through, and they may need to contact the Department of Highways, depending on the project. If there's wetlands involved, they have to go through the Army Corps of Engineers. And so certainly we don't have any authority over them, but I would reach out to the Army Corps of Engineers and say there's a project, they need a point of contact for you to evaluate, and work with and determine if this project's feasible, or what they need to do to move forward with their project. And so at that point, it becomes almost like a coordinator, and maybe that's a job I'll find too, as I think through the process, as someone to hire and help coordinate between all those agencies and facilitating to make sure that all those boxes are checked and that all the reviews take place.
Do you have a sense you can share, given how much interest you've had so far, or how many projects we could expect to go through this process in the first year, maybe?
Yeah, it's a very fair question, and it'd be a guess. How many do I think will be successful, or how many applications will we get?
Well, both. I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, I'll start with how many applications we're going to get. I think we'll get a lot, and I don't know what that means, but I mean, I think there's substantial interest, and again, I think there's substantial interest from legitimate companies, and I think there's substantial interest from other people who will have a hard time getting their approval. And so, my thought process, and I shared with the governor, and he agreed, is we don't hand out HIDC designations like candy. So when someone applies for this designation, they're going to have to pass muster with these things, or they're not going to get their designation, and they're not going to move forward. I would rather have 7 projects statewide that are successful and that are certified, and then 5 of them are successful, than go out to every company or every individual that applies and approve 100 and fail 95% of the time, and have everybody up in arms about projects that we probably thought weren't going to be successful in the first place. And so I think that there'll be a lot of interest. I think there'll be a lot of applications, and I think that they will be screened very heavily, and we will only give designations to projects that we think that we're going to be successful and that will be good community partners.
So what happens if a project doesn't get an HIDC?
They can't move forward with their project.
So I guess, I have a question, because in the case of Tucker County, that was not the process. And I know we've had a conversation about that, I think everyone's concerned. I think we're all on board with the idea that nobody wants bad actors, because it's costly to the state, it's messy, you get tied up in litigation, but that's exactly where we find ourselves with Tucker County. And I think one thing that also concerns me is that because of the secrecy, we had a gas plant not tied to the grid that they wouldn't, when we took the permit to DEP, we weren't allowed to talk about the fact that it was connected to a data center complex. So it was very hard to understand the full picture of what we were looking at, and the DEP spent quite a bit of energy dealing with the permitting process. There were 1,600 public comments submitted in concern to the permit, and they still granted the permit, and they've told us they've never refused a permit before. And they made very few substantive changes, and a lot of our comments were very technical. And so, we weren't allowed to bring up that issue because they didn't want to acknowledge it was AI data center. But when we said, why can't we see the redactions on paper, they said, well, it's going to be an AI data center. They basically said, we're in the AI race, so we have to build this right away. And we said, okay, well, aren't you using that as a justification? So it's a little confusing to me. Like I would be very excited if the process changed, but my concern is if you do it the other way, where you do the power generation and then do the letter of intent, then what happens is you spend all these resources, state resources, effort of the community in opposing something they don't want. And then I think in Tucker County, we're just left asking, well, what happens to us? Okay, so we came in before this better process was enacted, but now it's pretty clear we don't want it. How do we get rid of it?
Sure. A couple thoughts. One is, as I stated earlier, our office has not received a HIDC or a microgrid designation request from any project in Tucker County as of when I left the office yesterday. And so I can't, again, comment on on a project that I've never seen an application for.
But this certainly won't be the first one, because there's going to be power generation that comes first, because it'll go first to the air quality permitting.
Right.
So how do you get in front of that and say, okay, we need to see the full project, now we're going to screen out the bad actors?
I have an idea.
Okay, great.
Right.
I have an idea. We are getting places.
Well, we'll wait till that gets baked, right? Unless you want to share it tonight.
No, I have an idea. I mean, and so, this would be a coordination between Commerce and Department and the DEP. And so, that's a conversation that I'm more than happy to have with Secretary Ward about if projects are coming to DEP for air and water quality permits, have something on your questionnaire that says, is this for a data center? If so, have you received your HIDC designation? Have you received your microgrid designation? If not, go to Commerce and do that first. And that will free up DEP's resources as well on projects that are legitimate.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be a good start. Yep.
All right.
And I think just, wrapping up this theme, I think West Virginia has a history of making itself a future victim with poor planning. And so, who agrees with me in the audience? Okay. All right. So, applying critical thinking and what we've learned and lessons we've learned from data centers across the country, how can we mitigate this to make data centers successful in West Virginia? The all or nothing mentality. Oh, if you're a Republican, you must say yes to everything. Well, I'm not that way, and I don't think most people operate that way. And I also think if you're a Democrat and you say you have to be anti-data center in order to be a Democrat, I don't think they operate that way too. So we need to be able to have conversations and processes and study how subdivision regulations have progressed over the past 10 years for construction of data centers. So that's setbacks, regulations, safeguards, all these things that we're talking about, and applying local control to those. So I hope that, this conversation is a start, and I hope that we can build the transparency within the HB 2014 as it stands now over the next year, and then I hope next legislative session we have some answers that can be amended into the bill.
Thank you. I'll just do a quick station announcement. We're being broadcast on MetroNews Television, a subsidiary of WVRC Media. So I want to segue from that conversation to something that happened during the rulemaking process. So Nick Percivalli, the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, was there in front of the rulemaking committee. And he was asked, if counties provided suggestions or recommendations about what they'd like to see in data centers, would your office, take that into consideration? And he said, yeah, very much so. And Senator Patricia Rucker from here was asking that question. And, I know that this is to Commissioner Keyes. Last year in the spring, this issue came up to the Planning Commission. And Planning Commission's attorney advised, well, we don't need to, it's pointless to do any sort of regulations locally about data centers because it's going to be superseded by the state. In light of what what Chris is asking for, what the rulemaking was asking for, do you think Jefferson County should be revisiting that decision? And what can the county do to provide information to the state that would be helpful?
I think it's multifaceted. I think with what the bounds of the law currently, I do think we should. There's two things we can do with the bounds of the current law. We could advocate for a one-size-fits-all model, regulations, basic requirements, but these data centers, we don't know, other than the site for QTS, we don't know definitively where they're going. They're going to, in our view, which I also would like to just, for folks who are watching, I was disheartened by how quickly folks attacked the Berkeley County Commission, because those guys, with days' notice, they went down to Charleston and they fought this bill more than anybody in this room. And they dropped everything with a few days' notice. They drove to Charleston, which is about a 4.5, 5-hour drive, and they made this bill as good as they could. And they fought. And, they've tried to be transparent, and, they've been, I think, wrongfully attacked. And, but I think there's two things we could do. We could have a generalized rules that we'd like to see forward. And during the rulemaking process, I did, submit my own feedback. But as projects get announced, I think it's important to look at each individual site. So what are they close to? I want to understand how the residents surrounding that location will feel. So I can't speak for future projects because there's no transparency. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. We could have generalized requirements, and I think I've talked with you, Chris, about the generalities from folks in Jefferson County as to what they're passionate about, so but as projects get dropped in our lap, and then, we're probably going to be quickly blamed for them, how can I fight to mitigate them? And how can Berkeley County fight to mitigate their concerns, of representing their residents? And every county commission, every local, elected official, if it's dropped in a city municipality, how can that council advocate? So I think it's important to have generalized rules, and I'm happy to bring them forward. But I also think because this bill lacks so much transparency, and because we won't know until it's dumped in our lap from the sky, we should quickly hold some sort of public process and hear from local residents. I would want to know the surrounding landowners, how they feel. I would want to meet with them, and I'm going to have an open door. So when that happens, call me. And we can talk, but also public process, instituting something where folks can feel like they're being heard.
Well, I guess I'll ask the question to Chris from the other perspective. Would it be helpful to you to have a local planning commission, provide guidance in an official format? I mean, in Jefferson County, we have a very structured, we have subdivision regulations and the zoning ordinance, and even though it wouldn't have effect because it's preempted by the law, it still could be referenced by your office, correct?
Yeah, I think a couple thoughts, and that's one of the things that I've tried to do is reach out to the counties that do have those processes in place and see if there are best practices that we can implement as like a minimum standard across the state. And I think that goes back to Commissioner Key's thought on let's look at this from a statewide perspective, not just as a local issue. Yes, 100%. And then I also want to get back to the idea of, and this doesn't fix challenges on existing projects, but a couple things. One is the idea of having some proactively providing sites in advance so that as companies are evaluating them, they already know that there's community support and there's already been conversation around those potential sites as projects. So those are a couple of ideas, and certainly I'm open to having additional dialogue.
And so, Dada, so you've been through this process, before. What's most helpful to you, in understanding what a local community, wants? I mean, is it finding sites, or I presume that your company has people that go around looking for sites, or is it, understanding how a project could fit into a community?
Yeah, it is both. So we will screen in places like West Virginia. We'll engage with brokers, with officials. We'll engage with power company to get pointers on where do they feel is best place for us to be. That's kind of your step one. then we get into a 3-step process. The first step is just listening. So you'll have seen colleagues from QTS around the state. We have graduates of Shepherd University. As a matter of fact, we're on the phone. He was giving us direction to the Byrd Center, and we'll hire local people as part of this that help us navigate the local towns, right? And that's kind of all part of the listening and learning process. And then we spend a lot of time in the community. We are, in our journey. We're kind of in the initial stages. Then we go and we tell just the facts. And we do that on several topics that matter to people, and we try to design our projects in a way that fits the local kind of community, right? We talk about water, the surface water versus groundwater, make sure people understand we are not continuously consuming water. We fill it up from the surface once and done. We talk about emissions. And spend a lot of time teaching people and touring people from the community through the data centers so they understand that there really isn't any sound that you can actually hear, but these office buildings have a lot of stories and headlines that are captivating. So we try to tell people, show them, provide the facts, and then the community usually makes their conclusion at the end. But most communities that are reasonable, they just appreciate the process fact finding, and they give us the feedback.
Of course, you had a,
Just one quick follow-up. I think it's important to point out that the HIDC designation is the beginning of the process. And so when a project receives that designation, there still are a number of things that have to happen. And so, to the extent that we can involve, and that's something that we maybe can figure out together, is how do we involve as early in as possible conversations with local leadership with the companies, because I can tell you the companies want to have that conversation as well. I think Dotto's basically said that as well. So, I'm all about trying to solve that.
so how, but confidentiality is baked into the law. I mean, it specifically says that you're not allowed to talk about these projects once they come to your office. So how does that work? How can you talk to a community?
I think that it would involve the company and their ability to share information that they're willing to share that's not proprietary.
So does that become one of the screening criteria? If you have a company that's willing to share, does that sort of indicate that it is a good actor versus a company that doesn't want to share or can't share? Does that signal
I'd have to
anything?
think through it, but certainly there would have to be, I guess there would be, if there's compelling reasons, but I don't know what those would be.
Well, I think, we see attitudes changing across the industry. Microsoft has just said they're not going to do NDAs anymore. So I think, it doesn't have to be this way. I think also with the facility in Tucker County, the extent of the redactions was kind of beyond what would be proprietary data. For example, the height of a smokestack of a gas plant. And so I think it's a legitimate question for someone who lives a mile away to say, will I be able to see that? And they told us, you will not be able to see that. And we said, okay, so what's the height of the smokestacks? And they said, we can't tell you. So it's this circular reasoning
Yeah.
that I would like to say I trust all of them, but from being in this for about a full year now, and not willingly, this came to us, I do reserve a little bit of skepticism, and I think there is leeway, like Chris and I have discussed, Commerce can have NDAs, but you could put a member of the public under an NDA. I think there are ways that we can structure this process that engages the community, includes them, and not just in the conversation. I think something that we were concerned about is even those mechanisms for participation. For example, with DEP through the permitting process, we can give 1,600 comments on a permit and still have it approved. So what is the threshold for rejection?
Well, we're getting
So
close to
this,
the
to
end.
me, is like it's kind of like a democratic dog and pony show. It's like, it has to be binding, it has to have impact. If a community says they don't want it, then fantastic if there are companies that are willing to listen to that. But if they're not listening, who's going to represent the people of West Virginia when they say they don't want it?
I think
Well, I think we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to turn it back to Ashley. I want to thank again the panelists. I want to thank the Stubblefield Institute and Shepherd University for hosting us.
Thank you, Steve, and certainly thank you to our panelists, and especially to all of you for joining us tonight for this conversation. As we know, the future of data center development in West Virginia is not defined by a single viewpoint, and it is shaped by the intersection of these discussions. And so we greatly appreciate that you all are willing to engage in this discussion with us. We're able to listen to multiple points of view. And so finally, at the Stubblefield Institute, we do believe in bringing people together, and that these conversations are a critical process to stronger, more thoughtful civil discourse and responsiveness to our community issues. So we want to thank one more time the Observer Weekly for their participation and co-sponsorship of this event. We'd like to thank WVRC Media, who was a wonderful partner. If you want to share this event with others who are unable to attend, the link will be on our website later. It will be on West Virginia Metro TV their archives. And we hope you'll continue to stay engaged in these conversations and join us for future community engagement conversations. So to find out about our future events, you can visit our website, stubblefieldinstitute.org. You can follow us on social media or join our mailing list. So have a great evening, and we will continue our conversation out into the refreshments across the hall. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your facilitation.
Thank you.
Sure.
Steve, pleasure. Thank you. I'll have to send you this is my title for a minute here.
Oh, nice to meet you.
The energy capital strategy.